Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of your 3M channel. Um, I'm excited for another reason. First, thank you all for supporting the channel and showing love. We are doing baby steps, but we just hit 100 subscribers. So I wanted to thank all of you. It really means a lot to all of us because we are doing this because we love you and we love God and we love the truth and we love all this material we are studying, and we're just happy to share all this with you. So that's the first thing. The second thing, for tonight we have prepared the topic of Babylonian mythology. And for everyone who is wondering if we are obsessed with mythology or something like that, we are not. But why do we love and why do we bother even covering this topic? Is because we find so many similarities with the Bible, and we find the Bible to be, as what the scholars are saying, the ancient Near East document, which did not start existing in the vacuum, right? It has similarities with other ancient Near East nations. So, because of that, we want to study and show ourselves as diligent students and try to gather as many data so we can try to understand the cultural and historical context, especially of the Old Testament, so we can understand the context of the Bible better. So for this cause, I have invited my friend Paul Alli to come and join us tonight, and as an expert in some of these fields, share his knowledge. So again, we'll be talking about Babylonian theology. But first, Paul, welcome. And can you please share with us something about you when it comes to your spiritual background, theological background, and maybe share your testimony with us?
Yeah, it's great to be here and great to partner with you, Nick. I guess actually I gave a little backstory on that is that I had to look up and we started conversing around February 2022. And I think it was because of a Facebook post or comment relating to Dr. Michael Heise's work. And I posted something as a clarification, and then you reached out to me, and we've had this conversation for over a year now, kind of going back and forth. You mentioned back in the fall that the fall of 2022 that as you were coming to the end of your studies, you're going to be setting up the channel and. Initially, our conversation was based on some of the audio, visual, and text stuff because that's some of my background. And then as we chatted more, we found that we shared sort of some similar theological ideas and approaches and interests, and started dialoguing about some of the possible episodes we could do here and sharing. So it's my privilege to be here, and I'm excited to kind of converse with someone who is interested in the same things and is willing to dialogue about these. I suppose this is truism, but of course, my background starts with my parents, and really their journey has been important in my spiritual journey. So, to explain a little bit, my father was from a country called Guyana in the north part of South America. It's right on the coastline, kind of above Brazil there, but very different from the other countries around it: Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia. Um, his background is Indian, and their family is Muslim, so he was raised Muslim. Now, the country of Guyana has had very serious civil political issues, and in the 1960s there was a lot of bloodshed, so many people started to move away from the area. My dad came to Canada in either 1975 or 1976. I can't remember exactly, but he was a teenager when he came up here with his older brother and I believe one other person. And he was in school and started working and kind of paved the way for the rest of the family to come up to Canada. When he came to Canada, he basically became a cultural Canadian. He had some ties to his roots, beliefs, and family customs, but a lot of it he took on the culture of Canada in the 70s and 80s. And I don't know if I would call him an atheist per se, but he didn't practice a lot of beliefs as far as I know. My mother's family has been in Canada since the 1830s, 1840s. They came over mostly Scottish, a little bit of English and Irish. Um, And my grandmother was adopted, so we think her background is German or Polish, but largely Western European Christian background. My mom's family directly, once they settled here, were farmers. She grew up on a dairy farm in southwestern Ontario, and the youngest of six children. They went to church growing up. The country churches, either United or Presbyterian, and that was their background. So she knew about the Bible, about the gospel, and that sort of thing. But in some ways, it was a cultural thing. I'm not sure they talked a lot about being born again. Um, it was more than just being a good person. There was faith, and I think my grandparents had faith. I've heard some stories about that. Not just a habit per se, but it wasn't really in the evangelical vein. Um, uh, to say the United Church in Canada was a merger of Presbyterian and Methodist beliefs, and so you get some of that social gospel sort of thing going on there, but in a rural conservative setting. Long story short, when my dad came to Canada, he came up to Toronto, which is the capital of Ontario, and then my mom moved here for college. They met in the city in the early 1980s and got married. And at that point, they didn't really go to church. But when I was born, when my sister was born, they did recognize that faith had something to do with raising children well. I was baptized in the Presbyterian church as a baby, as an infant. But I can remember going to church as a young child, and I would have known the stories. I knew who Jesus was from stories, Moses, Abraham, David. Kind of the big characters. We were quite young, but my family did have some of their problems. My dad, in particular, had some issues, and my mom had gone through a really rough time before she moved up to Toronto. So, in the fall of 1992, when I was 6 years old, they divorced and they split. And so we went to live with my grandma on the farm for a bit before we moved into a little place called Stratford, Ontario. If anybody's out there and knows that name, you might know it because of Justin Bieber or the Stratford Festival Theater. I've got connections to both of those things, and it's not hard to do. It's about 30,000 people, so it's not tiny, but it's not big either. We grew up there, and I spent, from about 1992 until 2008 in Stratford or around there. After moving for a bit, we had gone back to a church for a bit, a Presbyterian church, again, and I knew we had some lessons there, but I didn't know about having a personal relationship with Jesus. Um, my mom was also very sick. She ended up with a chronic illness, and so weekends and time off was often spent sleeping or catching up on rest. But later, around 1996, as the summer of 1996, we had a family friend that invited us to a church that was close to where we lived. It was a vineyard church at that time, and my mom went to check it out a couple times to see what was going on, what they were about, see if it was a safe place. And I think through everything she had been through, she was looking for answers and meaning in life. That was part of what was going on, but clearly she was drawn there. After a couple of Sundays going on her own, then we went as a family and started attending regularly. And that's really where I got to know what was going on. And being a little bit older, I started going there when I was 10. And then started really learning. We worshiped, being a vineyard church. Sunday morning worship had a live band. There were 7, 8 people on stage, drums and guitars and that sort of thing. It was a more modern form of worship, which I really enjoyed. And then I grew in learning and understanding. And I remember they had Sunday morning services, but at one point they started some Saturday night services for younger adults, which at the time my mom fit in that category, and we would go, and evenings were easier to get over to the church instead of early mornings. And I remember being in a worship service, and the lights are kind of dim, and we're worshiping, and I kind of sat down on the ground and felt something kind of like a warm blanket like drape over me. and I knew that nobody else was there. I kind of looked around, and then nobody else was near me. No one put a blanket on me. But from what I had learned and what I had seen around me in the church, I knew that that was the presence of the Holy Spirit. And kind of I prayed, talked to God and said, is that you, God? I feel this thing, and I trust that it's you, and I want to know you more, and kind of decided to follow Jesus at that point, realizing that there was a reality to the spiritual world, and what they said about Christ and God was real as far as I could tell. So that was the start. I think I would have been about 11 at that point, maybe 12. And then not too long after that, we had some new pastors come to our church. I don't know if they'll see this, but Phil and Annette Tuttle, if you guys hear this, they were a big influence on me because they were about my parents' age, and they had two boys, and their older boy was the same age as me, and so we started attending youth group together, and the Tuttles taught us there, and one of the things I remember is that we went through the books of the letters to Timothy, First and Second Timothy, as a youth group, and that was encouragement and teaching to a younger person and to build your faith and to follow God, and the reward for us all going through the books of Timothy and answered some questions, make sure we were actually paying attention, was a foosball table, which is a big deal. So our youth group was rewarded, and around that time. I decided to get baptized. Right, I wanted to make my commitment to God even stronger, and so I went through believers baptism. And I would have been so I remember the experience, but I don't remember the date. Unfortunately, I would have been around 13 or 14. But just really knowing that I wanted to be committed to Jesus in that sense. And all through high school, I got involved. Around the same time, I got involved in music. I had started taking some guitar lessons through the church, through someone who's providing some lessons there. Put it down for a little bit, but then picked it up when I was a little bit older and really got interested in music and rock and roll. And I had a friend in youth group who was a drummer, and so we used to jam out together and make music, especially on Friday nights at youth group. And then the other part was I was invited to join our tech team and do audio, learn audio mixing, the audio console. And so those things went together, and I learned to be a part of the worship team and kind of build things up from that standpoint and learn how to be involved in ministry, really is what that was. And I think as a teenager, there were weeks where I pretty much lived at the church. I was there all the time for events and for worship and conferences and things that we started to do. So I did that. We went through another leadership change at my church when I was 16, nearly 17, and the Tuttles left because of some politics that were going on in the church, and they were fearful of a split, and they did not want the church to split, so they decided to leave instead. And we had new pastors come who had been tied into our movement. At that point, in the late 90s, John Wimber passed away, and so a number of churches had broken away from the Vineyard movement. We became non-denominational, but we had strong ties to Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship, who were part of the Toronto Blessing in 1994. And they are now, I think they're calling themselves Catch the Fire. And there's a whole group of Catch the Fire churches. That home church I grew up in, Stratford, is now a Catch the Fire church. And so these new pastors were tied to Catch the Fire and Partners in Harvest. They were parts of those ideas and a group of people, and they came to help build our church. I found as I got older and learned more and started thinking about my faith that the way the church was being led and what I believed and what I saw in the church weren't the same. And so I kind of had some struggles there as a teenager as I headed off to university. I eventually left for university when I was 19, 2005. My love for music, I should back up for a second. I was a pretty good student. or at least I got good grades. Realistically, I was a pretty bad student. I didn't study a lot. I could just remember things, and I had a lot of talents. I picked things up pretty quickly. Even now, I can cover a lot of ground. I can seem to get the big ideas really quickly. That's a gift that God has given me, I think. And so the advice I was given was to kind of follow my heart and do something I like, and I would do well. Um, Little at that point I didn't know the verse, but I wish I had known that, the above all things the heart is deceitful, and that's not necessarily a very good path to follow. But what I did do is I went off to university at Waterloo, and I entered the arts program and started in music. And so I did a lot of work in classical music theory, history, that sort of thing early on. I discovered that sort of writing, producing, and working in the classical world full time wasn't really where I was supposed to be, but I wasn't sure what was going on. I transferred into a degree of philosophy because I had discovered philosophy and the classical thinkers, and there was a lot there that made sense to me that complemented the faith. One of the things about the Vineyard and charismatic movements is that they very much work in the spirit. They emphasize the charismatic gifts, but sometimes the structure and explanations of things are not great. That was one of the things I really appreciated about the Tuttles when I was younger, is that they had come from a more conservative background in the States and spent time in Germany, and they were very biblically based. But as I got older, that seemed to go away, and I struggled with having a really good foundation or people that could explain things beyond personal revelation or explaining the Bible in just their own terms. Philosophy sort of filled in the gaps for me because there was structure, and I did a lot of work in logic and ethics, which are very structured. So that was helpful, but it still wasn't the whole thing. It also got complicated because in the fall of 2006, my father passed away, and he had his struggles, but he got sick pretty quick at that point and ended up passing. And because he didn't remarry, I was responsible for his estate, so I had to go through processing that and taking care of his funeral and the paperwork and everything that went with it. And then a couple months after that, in February and March of 2007, I was diagnosed with cancer, two different kinds of cancer. And so that whole process really kind of tested my faith as well. I knew God was real, and I knew that there was a plan, but all this other stuff was happening as well. So I thank God for being faithful through the whole thing, and I knew that it wasn't the end. So cancer treatments were easy in that sense because I knew I was going to get through it, even from the beginning. But had to really look out for what the future held. And after going through that, especially after I finished university, I kind of had to get a job quickly because of how my studies went and my illness, my student loans. There was a lot of paperwork there and things that didn't work out. So I didn't actually get to finish my degree fully. I have, it's not a general degree, but it wasn't a philosophy major, which is what I was working towards. And that left some sort of unfinished business in my mind, which I'll come back to in a minute. For a number of years, I kind of lived and worked with some friends in the area and back at a music store, and was working in music because I thought that was my passion. Um, but long story short, I wasn't really following God. I was just living life. I still believe in Jesus and that he was the Messiah, but my life would not have reflected that very well. In the spring of 2015, it all kind of came to a head. I was disappointed in my work. I was disappointed in the creative stuff I was doing. I wasn't doing a lot with music. I had had a couple of short-lived but messy relationships with girlfriends and things of that sort that just did not pan out, and I did not feel fulfilled whatsoever. Um, so I did something that was very difficult for me at the time, and it's still difficult for me now, if I'm honest. And I got down on my knees at the side of my bed, and I called out to God that I needed to do things His way. And since then, it's been a path back. I got a phone call shortly after that with a job opportunity. A fellow who has worked with churches as a consultant, but was also involved in the audiovisual field. And we had crossed paths a number of times in the preceding years. And he just left a phone message saying that he felt that God wanted to connect with me through him and that we should work together. So I ended up interviewing for a job in Mississauga and taking the job and moved up here. And in one way, that was God providing for me and opening up a door for practical skills, but also I was in the regular company of a couple of godly men that started to mentor me and get me back on track. And in particular, because it relates to today, they're also very interested in how myths and stories and some of the stuff relates to the Christian faith. And so I started thinking about it again, how the whole picture goes together. So in 2015, I moved and started this new path, and that sort of ran its course through to 2018. In 2018, I knew that I was going to be ready for something different. So I reached out to this friend again, a mentor that had called me before, and within a couple of months, a job opened up at a church, which is where I'm at now. It's a City Center Baptist Church here in Mississauga, and I was hired on there as a technical director. And again, that ended up being a place where I could use and sharpen my skills in audio visual, a little bit of IT background, music, but also God putting me in a place where I could learn more about Him, get deeper into Scripture. City Center is wonderful in its teaching, in its biblical background, and so that's been a blessing. The pastors that I've sat under, but what I've really come to learn is how to balance a couple of things. It's getting into Scripture, understanding Scriptural, having that background, understanding that there's a spiritual world and that the Holy Spirit is the real deal and He's moving and active. Understanding that there are other spiritual forces active in the world, and then also trying to see how all the stories, all the traditions play out through the course of humanity and how that's built up to where we are today, and sort of taking them seriously, even if they're stories, that they are representing something real and not just. Well, I'll say it this way. I think some of the anthropological studies, the archaeological studies, that sort of thing, has reduced some of these older stories and myths to simple, unscientific explanations of the world around them. And I don't think that's a very fair portrayal. I think ancient civilizations, as we find out more, were quite sophisticated. They may not have had science and technology in the way that we have it now, but they were being serious, other than when they weren't being serious for obvious reasons. But there's something real represented here that can help us understand where we're at in the world today. And I guess coming back to that, having read a lot, grade eight, I was introduced to the work of Tolkien, and within a year went through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and that sort of world really fascinated me. How those stories opened up, I had not really encountered something like that before. The following year in grade nine, in our English class, one of the things we had to do as an individual project, but to present, was sort of an overview of a mythology. And there were Greek myths and there were Norse myths and that. And by that point, I had kind of encountered those a little bit in studying Tolkien. I had done some reading on, the Northern European and Gaelic stuff that he had pulled in, a lot of the fairy stories and things to do with elves, and to do that. But I crossed, one of the options was Babylonian myths, and that really interests me because I recognize the name Babylon from the Bible. And so I was thinking, okay, what's this about? Maybe I need to know more about this. So way back then, that would have been about the year 2000 or 2001, probably the spring of 2001. I did a bunch of reading on the Babylonian myths to do just this class project and a presentation. And I found it really fascinating how some of it was similar to what we found in the Bible and some of it was different. And outside of my teacher, when I encountered most people or asked them about it, they would give me one of two answers. Is either it was, so that anthropological explanation that these are more primitive peoples and they're just trying to explain the world, and it's not scientific and it's a different kind of truth, or that there's not a very high level of truth represented in it. And that wasn't really satisfying to me, because if I'm comparing this to the Bible, what does that say about the Bible and Scripture, right? It just I thought a lot about the Bible, and this stuff was similar. So why do we have such a different explanation or evaluation of it? And then from the spiritual side, a lot of people would say that these myths are just the work of demons trying to confuse us, and that's all it really is. And that wasn't satisfying either. So I'm really glad that I've had a chance to come back and learn more about this, especially enabled by people like the work of Dr. Heiser, of Stephen DeYoung. I think of people like L. Michael Morales, Justin Bass, Judd Burton, that I've heard about, that have gone back to the ancients, and I think they're trying to take them seriously and find truth that applies to the Bible, because it is in the context of the ancients, but also, try to, what does that mean to us today, and how should we read it? And so that's what I kind of want to do today, is sort of present my understanding and try to get some of the highlights of what's going on there that might be able to help a lay Bible student that doesn't have access to all the other stuff, and share it. So when we were planning for this, I told Nick that 14-year-old me is very excited to finally find some of these answers and get to share them. So all these years later, I hope that this is a blessing to other people, as it's come around in my understanding.
Yeah, and if you remember, then I was messing up. I was like, "Hey, I thought you're older than 14."
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, yeah. Wow, that's a wow, quite a story. Well, first, I'm sorry, for all the pain and suffering you went through, but I also I'm glad that you didn't give up on God, which happens to some of us when we're suffering. There are always two options: to stay with God and go deeper, or to think God has abandoned you and just leave. So I'm glad that just ended up being victorious over all of this with Jesus, and I'm glad how He continued revealing things to you, so you could continue your education, but also learning and reading by yourself stuff that you found interesting, but not just things that may help you with academia, or maybe if you're involved in some church ministry, but also these nerdy things when it comes to mythology. And I'm also glad that you didn't give up when people were skeptical, or trying to, from good intentions of their hearts, I believe, but still as Christians be like, well, I don't know, but maybe come up with something like, well, why are you even bothering reading this? Why are you wasting your money on these
yeah.
books? Why are you, you know, what good is that? Like, and I can understand that perspective, but um, I'm also glad that you didn't give up on studying, and learning, because all of this, as you learn over the years, even though you couldn't see what will happen one day, but all of this is coming into a beautiful story of not just your testimony, but how God will also continue in the future to use you, including on our channel, like with your knowledge and with your experience, and that's wonderful. Yeah. So thank you for sharing, your story. um, okay, so you basically gave the explanation of why you found this topic interested in your introduction. So I think we can just start with breaking down the ancient religion of the Babylonians. And yeah, can we first maybe start with some biblical passages that you want to mention where do we find in the Old Testament Babylonian mythology, and how did the ancient Israelites, how did they deal with Babylonians and with their worldviews? Were they defensive? Were they attacking their theology? How did this
Mhm.
work?
Yeah. So this is pretty interesting when I was digging into it. And it's not maybe not as obvious as I would have assumed it would be, because of course, as the Israelites and later as the kingdom of Judah were rebellious against God, they are exiled into Babylon. Babylon comes and eventually conquers Jerusalem, demolishes it, right? And a great number of the people from the kingdom of Judah are taken into captivity away to foreign lands and into the area of Babylon. When I got digging into the scripture, of course, we've got books like Daniel that are set in the context of Babylon. We have Ezekiel, who's by the Kabar Canal, and he's dealing with a lot of Babylonian stuff. He's in exile there. We have the warnings from Isaiah and Jeremiah when it comes to their actual beliefs and religion and even the names of the gods. There's not that much content. I was sort of surprised. The name of Marduk, who becomes the high god of Babylon, is listed exactly once in the Bible, and that's it. Which, given how some of the Canaanite names and the Egyptian names come up, I thought that was pretty surprising, and we'll come back and talk about Marduk in a moment. But there are other things going on in their stories, in their religion, that I believe the Bible, at least indirectly, speaks about and corrects the course. I think in some cases it does it on a very wide basis, much as it would also sort of refute or push back against the Egyptian ideas and Canaanite ideas, um, against any other God than Yahweh, than Jesus Christ. But I think there are also some very specific references to things that are going on. And part of the reason I wanted to do this is because I think if we understand the context and some of the details of these other stories, we can clarify some of the confusing things that maybe we find in the Bible. And so we had a couple examples here, and I'll come back to a couple more in a moment. We'll probably do this a little bit more instead of listing them. I mean, we'll probably kind of deal with them as we go. But one is the first part of Genesis 6, Genesis 6 verses 1 to 4. Much has been made of this passage where it talks about the sons of God and the women of men, and then you get the Rephaim and the Nephilim that come about. And there have been many theories about this. Basically since it was written, at least from the Second Temple period onward. And even today, especially in the evangelical church, you will get quite a wide variety of explanations. I've got a couple ideas about it that I'd like to discuss and that I think, to me, make more sense than some of the theories. So we'll come back to that as I explain it. We'll need some context. Another one that comes up is as Israel enters the promised land, they come up against a couple of figures. You have Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. And in the middle of those stories, or towards the end, they describe the battles, and then they sort of describe what Og has. And there's this bed that is 9 cubits long. And that seems like a very specific detail. I know that Michael Heiser covers this and it pops up in a couple places, but I want to make a direct connection here with something else that's going to come up that is directly from the Babylonian traditions and rituals. The 9 cubits number is actually very specific and very important. There's also one more, and actually this wasn't on our list originally, but it's pretty interesting. I believe it's in Ezekiel 8. And I'm just going to cross-reference this. He has a vision of the temple, and at that point, there's a statue of the god Tammuz that's built there. And Tammuz is known as the dying god. He's not a super important figure in the stories. He actually gets blended into a couple other people, but that name comes up. The other name that comes up in scripture, actually more often, is Shemesh or Chemosh. Those are the same. One of the things, actually, I should take a small aside here. Throughout the ancient Near East, you have a lot of Semitic languages that are related to each other. They're cousins, and even to today, the remnants we have of Aramaic in things like Neo-Assyrian and in the modern Arabic language, they use the same consonants. So across all these Semitic languages, with small variations, the consonants are the same. From language to language, the vowels and the grammar changes a little bit, how you arrange things and the vowels. So you get these names that are very similar and are shared. And that's where you can hear Shemesh and Chemosh, they're very similar to each other, right? It's kind of like even for Tammuz in the older Babylonian language, it's Demuzi. You get kind of the same letters to it there, and just adjust it a little bit. I wanted to bring that up because that plays into a theory I want to share a little bit later on or in the future if we got to come back to it. I think it's pretty important in how this gets shaped or how we can understand it. So you get some of these things that are shared, and Shemesh especially. Shemesh is basically the word for the sun. And so you have the sun itself, but you also get the sun god. And of course, sun gods are very, very popular. They show up in almost every religion, mythology. And Shemesh or Chemosh or some variation of that is present in all of the ancient Near Eastern religions and pantheons. Possibly the other famous use of it in the Bible is that Solomon builds an altar or a giant idol of Shemosh on the hills east of Jerusalem, and that's there late into the Kings before the exile. It's up there. The same passage. I'd have to find where it'd be in First Kings. He builds the one to Shemosh, and he also shoot, I'm blanking now. Who is the god that the children are sacrificed to in fire? Um,
I
Starting with
know the deity, but my mind is also stuck.
yeah. It starts with an M, I think, but if I find it, we'll come back to it. So
Mm.
these figures show up in the Canaanite religion, and the same guy is there basically in the Babylonian stories. So that's pretty interesting that it comes up, and they're sort of shared and they're present. Of course, they talk a lot about idols, but as we see, I think there is a principality behind these things. I think there's some smoke and mirrors going on, and we'll talk about that more too. That they seem to shift, and whether that's just hard to understand spiritual things or let's assume these things are real, they're sort of trying to cover their identity so they can't be snuffed out too quick or sniffed out too quick. There's some of that going on as well, I think. So that's what's going on there. Probably one of the oldest stories that comes up is that of Gilgamesh, and we had the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is old, and I think it dates to about 2500 to 2700 BC. We know it's one of the older ones because throughout the Epic of Gilgamesh, the city of Ur and Uruk are very important. And those were more important cities in the kingdom or area of Sumer, which was the southern portion of what would become Babylon in the future. and they were Sumer was more powerful in the sort of early periods. They had two out of the three major kingdoms, and in fact, archaeologists sort of date the periods by the construction and reconstruction of the city of Ur. So you if you go to look at the documents, you'll hear things about Ur 1, Ur 2, and Ur 3. And these are cities that were kind of rebuilt on top of each other as important centers. So Gilgamesh being at and Uruk dates it pretty early because the power center shifts after that. But what's really interesting about Gilgamesh is that he's sort of a divine man, and his epic outright states early on that he's 2/3 divine and 1/3 human or mortal, and that comes from his parents. His father is sort of a mythical, legendary king. Um, his status as a deity or divinity is kind of questionable. It seems like he's elevated, but because he was a powerful king, he has sort of this status. But his mother is a goddess. She goes by the name of Ninsun, and one of the translations I found kind of translates her as Lady Wild Cow. And through this, then that's how he gets the 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Um, we also have excavations from the modern day city of Warka that tell us about a time where Anu and Inanna or Ishtar were the primary deities. Those are older names. Um, by the time you get the two kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer established, it's really Ea or Enki and Elul. So you get these generations of spirits that seem to kind of show up. And I think that's important to trace because we get some movement, and there's not really one supreme God through all of it, which is a direct contrast to what we see in the Bible and what we would believe about Jesus Christ. Um, so that movement is very interesting to me on how it changes or shapes throughout the stories. About half the gods that I could find and read really kind of keep their character and name and domain, and the other half really kind of shift around. And Shemesh is one of them. Shemesh is very important in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he almost nearly disappears later on. And so that's an interesting thing to me. Um, Gilgamesh, I think, is kind of important for three reasons. Number one, his epic says that he was the first one to record the flood story on stone tablets. That he's the one that brought the citizens the knowledge of it and some knowledge from before the flood and what was going on. So that's important. And there's actually two flood stories that kind of compete with each other, and I'll mention the second one in a second. So that's one thing. Number two, this whole thing about thirds, I find really interesting. The fact that he has thirds from two parents, as it's listed, is interesting. There is a ritual where I think you can end up with three parents, and that plays into Genesis 6 for me. It's how you could have two essentially humans mating, having intercourse, but ending up with a divine parent involved at the same time. But we'll have to wait for that because it's actually a little bit more related to Marduk. But I think it explains that this ritual understanding is going on in the background. I think it's also how you can get a woman that's in the city of Uruk but is a goddess. Um, that's interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a couple of things before you
Yep.
continue. First, I remember once when I was writing a paper on idolatry in my Old Testament biblical theology class, and what you mentioned about the pagan nations which surrounded
Mhm.
Israel. they were like, well, one of the things, one of many things that they were worshiping were the, the stars, the moons, and the sun. And in my research, the data I came to was that even Israelites, for some period of time, unfortunately, they were involved in this worship of the sun,
Yeah.
and it's a very I mean, this is the thing that happened all the time in the Old Testament. Their hearts would always go away from Yahweh, unfortunately, and they would always build up these things on high places, and pursue deities that were never supposed to be above them.
Hmm.
But yeah, I just wanted to connect with that archaeological data. Second thing, our friend Sean reminded us of the deity, which was Moloch. That was
Look, yeah.
yeah,
Thank you. That's who it was.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah. I remember as soon as just or at the same time when he was typing, and I was remembering, and I always, whenever I think of that name and of that deity, I'm always thinking of Dr. Frank Turek, who is of course not
yep.
as eloquent or famous, or some people may not like him. Like we have William Lane Craig when it comes to this cream of the top of Christian philosophy and apologetics. But still, I remember many times Frank Turek explaining how back in the days when these pagan nations would go and sacrifice their children, they would put it on the arms of the Moloch, the statue, and they would turn on the fire. And the drummers, as the fire was progressing, right, and catching up, the whole statue, the drummers had to play the drums so loud so that the cries of the babies would not affect, their parents who would be not that far from that ritual happening, which of course it's impossible, even if you don't hear the cry of your own baby. I mean, still it was devastating. But we see this throughout the whole history, not just in the Old Testament. God would give a period of time to pagans, to all these nations who were following other deities, to repent. And in one case, he waited for 4 centuries, right? I think it happened in the case of the same people who were worshiping Moloch, but they didn't want to repent. And then eventually, always God's judgment comes, which is not something that we necessarily like to talk about, because we may see God as vengeful, or he's too aggressive, or he's too similar to pagan nations. But he's not. His judgment is just and holy, and and it's needed. Yeah. So these were like the few things I wanted to say before I would forget, and before you continue with the next list. So did you want to now um, cover all of these subtopics, like all of them individually? Do you want to start with Gilgamesh, or do you want to start with Apkallu, or maybe with one of the deities? The floor is yours.
Yeah, yeah. What I'll say here is that I'm not going to read a ton from the stories. There's pretty easy access to documents like the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, which is a creation account that it involves creation, but the way I see it from reading is really the ascendancy of the god Marduk and why he's important, and it's out there. And I have some other fragments. What I can say, let me find this journal document. There is a book out there. There's a couple of them, but the one I read and have been going through is called Myths from Mesopotamia, and it has creation, the flood, Gilgamesh, and other accounts. And the translation is by Stephanie Daly, and it's part of the Oxford World Classics. I'll warn anybody that's interested in it, do not get the Kindle version. The Kindle version is broken and you cannot read it. So I'll save you the trouble. I went through that. You can get paperback. There's some other places. I was able to find a digital journal edition of it, but it's kind of flaky because it's a protected document. You can't copy and paste. And so that's why I'm kind of going through this quickly. I couldn't make a lot of extra notes on it. So pardon that. But I'll say actually, I need to give a shout out. Friend of the channel, Carrie Griffel, and her channel over at Genesis Marks the Spot. Yeah, big things up. Carrie actually has done a reading and analysis of the Numa Elish, and I think it's really excellent. She's got a better reading voice than I do, at least right now. If you can't hear, I'm actually fighting a bit of a cold, so pardon that. But Carrie's done a great job, and if you want to hear it, especially, I suggest going over there. And Carrie does a great job comparing some of the creation accounts. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but that's not quite what I want to focus on. So it's in there. Same with Gilgamesh. There's a flood account there. There's also another one called the Atrahasis, and that could be Atrahasis. And it's interesting because there's an overlap between those two flood accounts, but there's also some significant differences between them, and it would take us a lot of time to go through that. I more want to highlight stuff to see where it's the same and where it's different. The fact that you get a creation account, but the creation account really deals with a struggle, which is very different from what we find in the Bible, right? You get Genesis 1, Genesis 2, all the Psalms that refer to it, and we have the wonderful Yahweh just speaking, and creation comes into existence. And that is very, very different from what you find in the Babylonian stories and through all the ancient Near East stories, as far as I know, right? So you can do it there. I'm really interested in these characters and what come up, and there's a couple other connections that we're gonna talk about here. But there is a flood story, there is a creation story. You can find them pretty easy, and there's some other resources out there. Like I said, go check out Carrie's stuff. It's very well done. And I don't know. I guess I just find that stuff a little bit less interesting, or the comparisons are kind of very basic to me. I'm going to try to dig a little deeper here to some of the other connections that aren't as obvious. So that's what we'll aim for. Yeah, so Gilgamesh is there. Keep in mind that he is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. That's something we're going to come back to, and I'm going to explain again. There's another set of people, and they have their own sort of documents, and they're called the Apkallu. The Apkallu are divine or spiritual beings that are shown as advisors to the kings in Babylon, and they span a whole set of ages. And let me find where I had this. It's pretty interesting because we can confirm a number of the names on the Sumerian Kings list. But what's very interesting about the Sumerian Kings list is that it doesn't only tell us the names of the kings, it tells us the names of their sages and scholars. And the word for sage there is Apkallu. So that's where these guys come from. The idea is that well, what should tip us off as Christians is that Apkallu came from the depths. They come out of sort of the watery pit, as it's described in the Bible, and then these guys come up to influence kings. And when I read that, like red flags go off for me, right? Like, oh, this is not a good thing, right? This is not Yahweh. This is not a heavenly messenger. They're coming from below. So that's pretty interesting. So before the flood, there are 7 kings and 7 sages that are listed. But there's a very interesting thing that the King's List says. I got to read it here. So after the flood, during the reign of En-Merkar, the king, Nungal-Piragal was sage, whom Ishtar brought down from heaven to Iana. He made the bronze lyre, whose lapis lazuli, according to the technique of Ninagal, the lyre was placed before Anu, the dwelling of his personal god. So I think this is also pretty early because we have Anu as a personal god, and we see that a little less later on in the stories. But I find this fascinating that after the flood, in order to maintain the sages, God has to bring one back to the kings. So they seem to go away with the flood. To me, that lines up the content of Genesis 6, where we've got the Nephilim present, and then later on, Genesis 11, the Tower, 10 or 11, sorry, the Tower of Babel, and we've got spirits that have to descend again and are scattered to the nations. This lines up to me, doesn't it? Right? Like that's connected there. And the fact that a higher God being an Ishtar who is all over the place in these stories, is bringing down a sage to connect with the king. Again, red flags going off for me. And then right after that is the reign of Gilgamesh, the king. And at this point, at Gilgamesh, they're no longer called Apkallu as sages, they're listed as scholars. So these spirits are sort of downgraded afterwards too. There's a change that goes on after the flood, which I can't completely explain, but I find that very interesting.
Paul, do you
There's,
think
yeah.
do we can we draw a parallel between Apkallu and the Watchers? So the fallen being, like you said, divine or small Elohim, small e with the
Mhm.
Elohim. So can we make parallels between Apkallu and Watchers to be the same, or maybe even similar beings? And the second question is, when it comes to King's List, are those the list and names which were recorded, where supposedly all these divine kings lived dozens of thousands of years? Is that what we are talking about?
Yeah, so part of the King's List gives their reigns, and early on, it's really long. Like I think one of them lives for 28,000 years or something. It's like crazy. But clearly, they're not just regular human beings. And I think the easiest way is to highlight it this way. So the second king before the flood is Dumuzi. Remember, that's the same name as Tammuz, who is regarded as a dying god. That says something. And then the first king completely after the flood is Gilgamesh. And the end of the oh, they change it. There's a couple versions of this, but actually Nebuchadnezzar is listed in one of these lists as well. And so it spans a huge amount of time. Like even if we take kind of just the conventional biblical timeline, and maybe there's about 4,000 years from creation to the birth of Christ or whatever it is, or 6,000 years, like it would cover the whole thing in just 14 names.
So
So,
we are not supposed to take literally, according to what I'm trying to understand from you, when it comes to this king's list, Sumerian king's list, like you just said, one of them lived and ruled for 28,000 years. Are we supposed to, in your understanding, take these years as literally, or they're more symbolic, representing something?
so in the ancient world, numbers had a lot of symbolic meaning. I think that's played in, and it's hard to say. If I'm honest, I would say totally, I don't know. I haven't made up my mind completely, but there's a couple principles we can kind of rely on. I think some of the numbers are picked on purpose because they're supposed to have their own meaning.
Like 60, correct? In their worldview, number
Yeah.
60 was very important, in the same way that for Jews, 7 or 12 or 3 were important. That's what I remember from reading a while ago.
Yeah, 12 was important to the Babylonians too, I think, and that's how they get 60. We get our time and like 360 degrees from the Babylonians. So the 12s and 60s and how it divides all come from there. Yeah, you're right. You're on the right track. Yeah, but yeah, there's all kinds of, I mean, you get Hebrew gematria is probably one of the most elaborate systems, right? And all the numbers have meaning and they add up and that sort of thing. There's a similar thing going on here. The other part too is I think they're trying to emphasize the superhuman aspect of some of these kings. In the case of Gilgamesh, depending on the list and story you get, the name of his father and grandfather are different. So whether they're skipping generations or trying to highlight somebody different, they're kind of being selective. And this happens a little bit in the Bible too. We get genealogies that seem to skip a generation here and there. I think the ancients didn't write this stuff like an encyclopedia. They're trying to give us the what they think is the important information, right? But it's interesting. It covers a lot of ground, and they're bringing up very specific points of data in trying to share this. The fact that you have a couple of people that really show up in the other stories and are deified is very interesting. So,
Yeah, cool. I remember the explanation. You know how sometimes people are trying to figure out and reconcile how old is the planet with like,
mhm,
or what
mhm,
is the Bible saying? And one of the things I remember reading again a while ago is that when genealogies were given, including in Matthew and in Luke, they were not Matthew and Luke did not cover every single generation, every single male as the head of that household of that generation. They were skipping, but they included certain names so that people who were reading that, for example, if Matthew was written primarily for the Jews, the Jewish audience who were not believers in Jesus Messiah, so they could have traced that line and see certain strategically written names, and they're like, like they would these names would be connected in their mind to something historically important.
mhm,
So
mhm.
could it be that the same thing was happening in other ancient Near East countries?
Yeah,
Like, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've started to study some of the Semitic languages. I've been taking some seminary courses, and I've got a little bit of background in Hebrew now. I also have some friends that are actually from they identify or their culture is Assyrian. They're from Nineveh province actually, which overlaps with this, and it's held over. So I've been learning some Assyrian words and how that works. And in the language, especially in the older version of the language, when you come to ancestry, things like mother, father, son, daughter don't necessarily represent direct relations. It's more up and down ancestry. And then we get more specific later on. And so you really, really have to use context to figure out what's going on here. Think about the Bible when. Especially Jacob says he's going to go rest with his fathers. Well, he probably means directly Isaac, his father, Abraham, his grandfather, but also generations before that. And my understanding is that they more or less use the same word. And so you need to understand what's going on there. I think as it develops and as they felt the need to be more specific, they would qualify and add more descriptors to it. But we translate it as mother and father and son and daughter, but it's more sort of up and down ancestors. So you need to be careful there because their concept of the connection is different from our concept. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and just to go back to the I don't know, will we be dissecting more of the Apkalus. So again, do you agree like that these things match what we see as vultures in Genesis 6?
I think it's a mix. I think the Apkallu could be the Watchers. I could also see if we're assuming that there's a real presence behind people like Enki, Elil, Ishtar, that those could be the Watchers as well. There are other spirits that are clearly not in line with Yahweh. And so they're in there again. I think there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on to this stuff too. I think there's some spiritual stuff where they've revealed a certain amount of their character, but they've probably also hidden some. So I hesitate to completely identify them the same way. Um, yeah, but and there also seems to be generations, Enki and Enlil are are sort of a second generation of God after Apsu and Anu. Um, and then Marduk is said to come after that. So is this the Watchers and then demons? Are there other principalities in between? The generations and hierarchy there isn't clear, and I'm not sure it's supposed to be clear, other than maybe more common to people is Greek mythology, right? You got sort of the initial creation, and then you've got the Titans, and then you've got the Olympians. The same sort of thing is going on. But if we assume the Titans and the Olympians, and then the later demigods are all kind of there, how do we identify them with the Watchers, right? It's that's a tricky thing to me. Um, yeah, I will say this because it's related. We have one writing from the Second Temple period in fragments. It's called the Book of the Giants. It seems to be related or done in the same style as things like the Book of Enoch. And one of the reasons I bring this up and want to bring it to people's attention is that it's in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but flat out, the Book of the Giants say that Gilgamesh was a giant. He is in there. And so, almost 2,000 years later, because the Epic of Gilgamesh goes back to about 2,500 BC, maybe the Second Temple stuff starts around 500 BC. It could be even later than that. But this idea has remained and was important enough to be written down over 2,000 years later. And so that's why I'm kind of bringing it to the light, because I think that there's stuff going on in the background even if the Bible is not directly referring to it. And that's why this is important.
Yeah, I just wanted to read one small paragraph, which is a part of the paper which I, wrote um, for one
Yep.
research paper. But here I'm including in this quote Dr. Amar Anus, who I don't know if he's a Christian, but most of us who are, biblical nerds and following the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, we
Mm-hmm.
have heard of Dr. Anus because his work on the ancient Near East religions and mythologies is very important. Again, I don't know his spiritual status, and in this context, it may not be very important because he's approaching to this as objectively as possible as a scholar. So even Dr. Heiser and some other Christian theologians are quoting the work of Dr. Anu. So I just want to read a few sentences, which back in the days I wrote for my paper. In his research of the Mesopotamian context of the Watcher's narrative, Dr. Anus compares biblical Enoch with King and Meduranki and argues that theologians in general agree that these two characters could be the same person. In the ancient Mesopotamian writings, Apkallus were called the sons of God, and Nephilim or giants were their children, which seems to flawlessly match Genesis 6, verses 3 and 4. Gilgamesh was one of the Apkallu, and according to Dr. Anu's research, they were punished by a flood according to the Era epic. In First Enoch, the flood was considered to be the final judgment for the fallen angels, combined with the punishment of fire, as Apkallus are sent down to Apsu. I think this is abyss. The Watchers and their sons will be led away to the fiery abyss and to the torture and to the prison where they will be confined forever. I don't have to read the whole passage, but um, I was very interested how Dr. News helped Christian theologians to connect the dots between
Mm-hmm.
biblical narrative and the ancient other ancient Near East narratives and find similarities, even though like you said, maybe we're not completely sure if these are the
Mm-hmm.
same things. But it's so interesting, even with different names coming from different nations. Not just the creation stories that may have some similarities, but flood stories are so similar. But also the fallen angels and the Apkallu or the Watchers, call it whatever you want to call, or the
Mm-hmm.
giants, and God judging them, or their main deity judging them. It's so fascinating to me because in the minds of many skeptics and atheists, they'll be like, "Oh, the Bible stole from there," but rather for me over the time this thought pattern change. No, like I see all these civilizations writing what they're witnessing,
Hmm.
and then combining these writings. And as long as these neighboring countries were either having war with each other or trading or having intermarital relationships, for me it's perfectly normal. And the only logical things that also some of their faith traditions and religions and beliefs would mix and be they will influence each other
Hmm.
inevitably. So for me, seeing all these flood stories or seeing all these giant stories or seeing this thing with watchers just being called in different religions, they're not necessarily stealing or copying from each other. They're witnessing and living in the same time in the same era. So they're witnessing the same thing, just using different names and nouns. And for me, that's fascinating because it I don't think, oh, these people stole from these people, but rather, this just confirms, but by having different sources, that what Bible is saying, is true. So for me, that's very comforting.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because the era epic kind of says that Gilgamesh is an Apkallu, or hints at that, but the King's List says that there's Gilgamesh and then he has an Apkallu, right? So, and I think there's two ways to look at that. There's kind of the common, I would guess, the anthropological explanation that, this stuff was talked about and passed on and kind of changed like a game of telephone before someone wrote it down. But then you get these different written versions because of the verbal tradition. There's probably a little bit of that going on, but the ancients were better storytellers and kept better details than we did, as far as we can tell, right? We've got other things that we can write down, use our phones even today. So I'm just not completely convinced by that. I think it also actually completely ignores any real spiritual world. And so this is where, again, I think there's a little bit of a game of smoke and mirrors going on where, depending on how people responded to, let's say, the influence of the Apkallu, eventually in a lot of the stories, they lose favor. And so are they trying to change the story and influence people and kind of twist it about as well? Which, given that they're tied to, he's not an Apkallu, but in the stories, actually this comes up in the Numa Lish later. There's a guy named Kingu who kind of takes over. He's called a demon prince, like flat out, but he becomes the consort of Tiamat, and then he's kind of in charge of some stuff before Marduk comes back and kind of pulls him out of power. So, how much do you trust someone that's called a demon prince? And I think even in the ancient world, that was not a good thing, right? So, yeah, we'll have to cover that maybe in another piece here. But I'm trying to grab the big ideas. The fact that we get, oh, First Kings 22, where there's the divine council scene about how Ahab will be disposed, right? That's all going on, and you have this spirit that's going to be a lying spirit in the tongues of the prophets. Like, to me, that's the Apkallu. That's that same principle, is that there are spirits that can influence and are talking to people, and it's not an angel or Yahweh or the devil directly. There's other things at work. And so I think I would tie those principles together more so as sort of a divine council kind of thing, and some of them being loyal and some of them being rebellious, more than the watchers outright.
Yeah, I was thinking because I know both you and me have some other plans, and that we're almost done with the first episode. I know that we will continue this within a couple of weeks, but I was just wondering, we have so much material left to cover for the next time. One of
Mm-hmm.
these deities, one of these beings. Um, we'll see more stuff that you have prepared as goodies for our viewers. But I was just wondering, for the end of this episode, um, what can you suggest to all the Christians, all the skeptics, but in this context, maybe especially Christians who are scared or concerned, or don't even, or let's say they're curious and they want to investigate with mythologies, where they should start and what should be their attitude and their position of their hearts and minds? Should they be too careful, too guarded, or should they be open minded and curious and just let that curiosity feed itself by just grabbing any book and reading? Do you maybe even have
Mhm.
any titles to suggest so people can start, like, especially with the ancient Near East religions and mythologies, because they are connected with the Israelites much more
Mhm.
than the Greeks or Romans or Egyptians. What would be your concluding thought and recommendation for our viewers?
Mhm. So, some of the people I grew up with were very skeptical about learning, quote unquote, worldly things. But I think understanding history and where people have come from and taking it reasonably serious is important. And I would approach it this way. I was recently reminded of 1 Corinthians 8, and in there, Paul talks about idols and sacrifices and having knowledge of these things. The knowledge of the stuff in particular is not really a problem. It's how you approach it and what you do with it. So I would make two recommendations. First of all, if you're going to put work into anything, do it for the love of God, right? You do it for Jesus Christ. And um, uh, if you're eating or sleeping or working or studying, whatever it is, do it out of respect for Jesus Christ, and maybe do it for the world he's created. This is a very vast, wonderful world. Humanity is incredible. Yes, we're fallen. There are lots and lots of problems, but there are lots of wonderful things too. And so don't be afraid to explore, but also keep it in context. Understand what you're reading is coming from. I would say understand that none of it is more important than Holy Scripture. Know your Bible first. Know Jesus Christ first, right? Even as a Christian, if you're reading your Bible and you don't pray or have a relationship with God, like it's just head knowledge. It'll puff you up, and at some point you'll pop like a balloon. But if you're interested in bits and pieces, for me it's been the classics. For me it's been music and football and mathematics at time. I see triangles and squares in everyday things, and I think it's wonderful. And I've had to do some reading on it. This stuff interests me, and as I got into the work of people like Dr. Heiser, it's made me want to go deeper and learn more. But I do it all because I want to understand how God works, what He's done, to a point, what's working against Him, and how I can have authority in the world and what's happened. So I do it so that I can grow in God and grow in my ministry, both formally as I look to go into a pastoral role, but also informally in understanding people, in dealing with people. That's if you've heard us talk tonight, we're not bashing any of this stuff. I don't think it's the whole truth, and I should go start making sacrifices to these gods or something. I don't think that's appropriate. But I do think that there was a real people that were experiencing something and were trying to explain it. And I think there's a carryover into how our world was shaped and what we see today. And so don't don't be afraid. Be afraid only of the Lord. He's the one that holds everything in the end. But approach it cautiously. Be a little bit critical in that, this is not necessarily the truth of God, but it can help you put some puzzle pieces in place. And that's how I approach it.
Brother, this was wonderful, and I know we have just only began talking about this. This is why I'm hoping we'll do, well, not just one. We'll continue exploring these ancient myths and
Hmm.
finding some beauty in that, but also on the other side, acting as apologists,
Hmm.
educating the body, the flock entrusted to us by Lord Jesus, and also, warning them, hey, this is just, for example, like what you said. We are not burning any sacrifices. We are not inviting these deities and demonic spirits, uh, and we're not playing with them. But it's good to investigate, and not just because we are curious, but because, as every good soldier would know this, when you're going to army, your general would always come with a strategy where he would first do his homework of studying the
Yeah.
enemy, studying their strategy, studying their army, who they are, their identity, the way they're operating, which is the same thing we see in sports. We see coaches joining all these papers and explaining the team tactics to their players. So I don't see much difference to what we are doing here. So again, we're learning and educating ourselves and others for the sake of just showing them some ancient context so they can better understand the Bible, but also warning them, hey, even though these deities are named differently in different civilizations and cultures, we believe that behind these deities, there are real demonic powers, and sometimes even bigger than demonic powers. There are fallen divine entities like small in Elohim beings who are much more powerful than demons, and this is how they were like portraying themselves and revealing themselves in different parts of the world, deceiving these people and leading them in that way. And this is how Yahweh is different. And sometimes these civilizations in these countries would even clash among each other. And, all these pagan nations would having war with Israel, and we see how that would end up. So again, I believe what we are doing and what you're teaching us, and thank you so much for your time. That is very important for the body, especially that this um, mythological aspect is neglected. Well, one of the many things taught today in churches that is not being taught in churches is this aspect, and I believe what you're doing in what you're studying is important for us. So yes, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for sharing your notes and your vast knowledge. And I'm looking forward to do the second episode probably by the end of May. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching us, for spending your time. Please continue supporting the channel and showing your love. And I wish you a wonderful weekend. God bless.